Islamabad was effectively locked down before the first serious negotiation even opened, as Iranian officials flew in and J.D. Vance prepared to arrive with the U.S. team. The hotel expected to host the talks was turned into a controlled zone. Roads were sealed, and the city was treated less like a capital awaiting diplomacy than a capital bracing for impact. That is the first truth in this story. The people hosting the talks do not trust the ceasefire enough to behave like peace has actually arrived. A sudden two-day public holiday emptied Islamabad and turned the city into a controlled shell before the delegations even sat down. That detail changes everything because it means the danger is not something waiting after the talks. The danger is already close enough, immediate enough, and credible enough that the host state cleared the capital first and hoped diplomacy could catch up second. The promise hanging over Islamabad is that this could be the room that stops a war devastating the region. But nobody locks down a capital this hard because they feel safe about the deal they are about to discuss. They do it because they know one strike, one provocation, or one move outside the room can turn peace talks into the last calm headline before the whole thing blows open again. If you come to this channel for the layer under the headline, subscribe now and tell me in the comments what breaks first. Lebanon, Hormuz, or the talks themselves, because this entire story is really about which pressure point snaps before the cameras can sell you hope. Security was intensified at checkpoints across Islamabad ahead of the US and Iranian arrivals. That is not the posture of a host preparing for a routine summit. It is the posture of a state trying to keep a fragile opening alive long enough for negotiators to enter the room before violence somewhere else decides the room no longer matters. So the real question is not whether talks are happening. They are. The real question is whether the ceasefire is real enough to survive the hours before, during, and immediately after those talks, or whether Islamabad is just a heavily guarded stage, built around an agreement that was shaky from the moment it was announced. That is what the audience clicked for, not a calendar update, not a diplomatic schedule. The click came from the feeling that if a capital has to be sealed before peace talks begin, then something inside the peace itself may already be rotten. Just days earlier, the entire process was hanging by a thread during what were described as intense, breathless hours when the talks were almost dead. Only after that did Iran agree to a temporary ceasefire without preconditions and to enter negotiations. So these talks are not the natural next chapter of a stabilizing conflict. They are the emergency product of a process that nearly collapsed before it could even be sold to the world. And a process born that way behaves differently. It can generate headlines fast, optimism fast, and official statements fast. What it cannot generate on command is a shared understanding, a shared definition, or a shared discipline across all the actors who still believe force can improve their position before the text hardens against them. That is why Islamabad feels less like a diplomatic capital right now and more like an operating room. The surgeons may be inside. The problem is that the patient is still moving. At the center of this entire crisis is a brutal fact. Nobody seems quite sure which of three different 10-point ceasefire agreements has actually been agreed upon. That is not some boring drafting problem buried in the fine print. That is the kind of ambiguity that lets every government tell its own public it won't, while privately walking into talks with a different map of what peace is supposed to mean. And once that happens, the ceasefire stops being a firm platform and becomes a weaponized blur. Every side can claim compliance. Every side can claim betrayal. Every side can insist the other one violated the spirit of the deal, even when the letter of the deal was never clear enough to survive contact with the battlefield. This is the hidden violence in diplomatic language. Officials talk like ambiguity buys flexibility. In reality, ambiguity under active fire often buys time for the next accusation. Iran has repeatedly said the ceasefire covers attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Pakistan has echoed that position. Israel and the US say Lebanon is not included at all. That is not a side argument living on the edge of the story. That is the story. because it means one major strike in Lebanon can instantly become either an acceptable military action or the event that proves the ceasefire was broken from the start. There it is. That is the one strike from collapse mechanism the title is promising, not a vague sense of tension, a live fault line. If Lebanon is inside the truce, a serious strike there hits the diplomatic architecture itself. If Lebanon is outside the truce, then the outrage over such a strike becomes part of the battle over who gets to define the deal after the fact. Either way, you get the same terrifying result. The negotiators in Islamabad may be discussing peace, while another front still holds the power to rewrite the meaning of that peace in a single afternoon. The threat was visible almost immediately as Israel expanded strikes in Lebanon and Iran moved again around the strait. That matters because it shows the war never fully accepted the pause that diplomacy announced. Publicly, leaders can speak the language of de-escalation. Operationally, key players were still preserving leverage in the air and at sea. This is where most coverage gets too soft. It treats the battlefield and the talks like two parallel stories. They are not. They are the same story. Every strike, every warning, every movement around the corridor is a message aimed not just at the enemy, but at the table. So ask the harder question, who actually controls whether these talks live? The answer is not simple, and that is exactly why Islamabad had to be locked down. The people in the room are not the only people writing the outcome. The ceasefire was described as being on shaky ground after Israel launched its deadliest day of strikes on Lebanon so far. That is not a symbolic challenge. That is a real-world stress test on a truce that was barely old enough to claim legitimacy. When a ceasefire is hit by violence of that scale, almost immediately, fragility stops being a caution and becomes the core operating reality. And notice the sequence. The strikes did not come after a long period of failed diplomacy. They arrived while diplomacy was still trying to establish itself. That means the talks in Islamabad are not inheriting calm and trying to deepen it. They are inheriting unresolved fire and trying to keep it from spreading faster than the negotiators can speak. That is why the opening has to feel dangerous, because the facts are dangerous. Anything softer than that would be dishonest. The ceasefire was already staggering under three weights at once. Israel's bombardment of Beirut, Tehran's continued chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz, and uncertainty over whether the talks could find common ground. That is a lethal mix. It means the military front, the maritime front, and the diplomatic front are all unstable together, each one capable of wrecking the others. That is how a crisis becomes larger than the headline. Lebanon keeps the military fuse burning. Hormuz keeps the economic fuse burning. Islamabad becomes the place where officials are desperately trying to stop those two fuses from touching each other again. And once you see the structure, the story becomes much darker. This is not peace trying to replace war in a clean sequence. This is war trying to negotiate the terms on which it might temporarily pause without surrendering its leverage. Iranian forces warned that ships trying to pass without permission would be destroyed. That one warning cuts through all the language about openings and opportunities. A ceasefire that still coexists with that level of maritime coercion is not settled. It is armed, conditional, and still being enforced through fear rather than transformed into something stable. This matters because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another talking point in a foreign policy briefing. It is leverage with global reach. The second that corridor remains under threat, the story stops being a local negotiation and turns into a pressure event for energy, shipping, markets, and every state dependent on movement through that water. So while the camera goes to Islamabad, the real lie detector is still at sea. If the route stays choked, then the rhetoric of peace is outrunning the reality of control. Tehran's move to effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz hit a route that carries around 20% of the world's oil and gas during peacetime. That is why these talks matter, far beyond the capitals directly involved. Once that corridor tightens, the war starts moving through prices, supply chains, insurance costs, shipping decisions, and allied calculations, far from the original battlefield. That is also why a weak ceasefire here is more dangerous than a normal diplomatic failure. It does not simply mean another bad round of talks. It means the global system has been reminded that coercion still works, and that the route back to normality can be held hostage, even while negotiators claim progress. This is the deeper payoff of the title. Islamabad is locked down because the room matters, but the Strait proves the room is not sovereign over the crisis yet. At one point, 230 ships loaded with oil were waiting to get through the Strait and had to be allowed to navigate without condition. That queue is the physical shape of a weak ceasefire. Not a podium, not a handshake, not a flag behind a desk, a line of delayed energy sitting under the shadow of war, proving that the truce on paper had still not restored normal movement where it mattered most. And that image should stay with the viewer. An emptied city in Pakistan, a queue of trapped ships near Hormuz, one capital, one corridor, both held in suspension while governments argue over whether peace exists, what it covers, and who gets to define it. That is a much more honest picture of this moment than any smiling diplomatic still frame. It also gives the story a human edge that the official narratives erase, because behind every closed hotel, every sealed road, every delayed ship, there are people trapped inside systems of pressure they did not design. Staff pushed out, crews waiting, families exposed to price shocks, and escalation cycles they cannot control. For Pakistan, this conflict poses some of the biggest economic and energy security challenges in its history. That means Islamabad is not hosting these talks from some lofty place of detached mediation. It is hosting them because the cost of failure sits close to home, and because every shock that moves through the region threatens to move through Pakistan too. That is why Pakistan's role has to be read correctly. Yes, there is prestige in being the bridge. Yes, there is diplomatic value in being seen as the indispensable channel. But underneath that is something far more urgent. Pakistan has exposure on too many fronts to let this spiral without trying to arrest it. And yet exposure is not the same thing as leverage. Pakistan can host, relay, persuade, and protect. What it cannot fully control is whether outside actors decide they can still gain more from force than from clarity. That is the limit to haunting the entire script. The information war around this moment is brutal for exactly that reason. Washington wants the ceasefire, framed as proof that pressure worked and Iran bent. Tehran wants the ceasefire, framed as proof that it survived, held its ground, and forced talks without surrendering dignity. Israel wants room to keep pressure on Hezbollah without being boxed in by a deal it did not design. Pakistan wants the world to see an indispensable mediator, instead of a state trapped by the spillover of someone else's war. The trouble is that all four of those narratives can be politically useful while still leaving the ceasefire dangerously underdefined. That is why the official confidence coming from different capitals should not calm you. It should make you more suspicious. In crises like this, the louder the public certainty, the more likely it is covering a private lack of alignment. So here is the hard answer to the audience intent behind the click. You clicked because you sensed this was not a normal peace talk story. You were right. This is a story about a ceasefire that may exist politically, but not yet operationally. A story about a host city locking itself down because everyone involved understands that diplomacy is trying to land on a runway that is still being shelled from the edges. If the claim from Iran and Pakistan is true, and Lebanon is part of the truce, then the ceasefire is hanging by a wire, because Israeli action there can destroy the logic of the talks almost instantly. If the claim from the US and Israel is true, and Lebanon is outside the truce, then the deal is still hanging by a wire because the public was sold a ceasefire whose actual boundaries were too unclear to stabilize the region. In both versions, the same conclusion remains standing. The agreement is too unresolved to safely carry this much fire. The same dual truth applies to Hormuz. If Tehran truly accepted a reopening and the route is still constrained, then implementation is already breaking down. If Tehran never intended to reopen on the terms Washington implied, then the public announcement raced ahead of the reality. Either way, the Strait exposes the same underlying fact: coercion has not left the system. That is why Islamabad's lockdown is the perfect symbol for this entire moment. It is not proof the crisis is under control. It is proof that the people closest to the crisis know control is thin, temporary, and vulnerable to outside shock. The city was locked down because the ceasefire itself is not yet strong enough to walk into those talks without armed protection wrapped around every mile of the approach. So, can the talks still matter? Absolutely. They can matter a lot, but only if they do something harder than generating contact. They have to narrow the definition gap, force a shared understanding of the fronts that count, and reduce the space for public narratives that contradict the private structure of the deal. If they fail at that, the ceasefire will keep looking less like peace and more like a short pause negotiated between people who still expect the war to return. And that is the final conclusion you should leave with. Islamabad is not the end of the war. It is the last fortified room before the war decides whether diplomacy gets to continue. Stay with this channel. We track the fracture lines that decide the next escalation before the headline learns how to admit them.